Booktube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for two modern classics, and what a fantastic week it's been. Both 5 stars, both will very likely get into my top 10 books of the year. Yeah, just a supremely good reading week. The first is W.J. Sebald, The Rings of Saturn, which is my second Sebald read after The Emigrants. And the other is my second George Perec of the year, and my second buddy read with Celia of said George Perec. This is W, or The Memory of Childhood. I'm going to start with the Sebald. So, in 1992, having just finished a writing project, Sebald has that sort of feeling of liberation, of a burden off his shoulders, and took himself on a walking tour of Suffolk, which is on the east coast of Britain, of England, and is probably one of the least densely populated areas of England. It's rural, but it's also full of lots of nuclear power stations on the coast. And in a way, the book starts sort of the wrong way round, because a year to the day after he started that walk, he ended up in hospital, sort of feeling very enervated, lacking energy and everything. And that's when he started to write this novel, which is sort of his account of that walk. But the central image is set up in that while he's lying in hospital, he's sort of bedbound, all he can see is a window, and the angle that he's at, he can only see the sort of the sky, the clouds in the sky, and that sort of as a frame on the world, that's all he's got access to. And that's sort of the central imagery of this book, where the sort of the remoteness of the places he's walking in Suffolk, the emptiness of, it's just people aren't around. He has this sort of discombobulating feeling of the world having been shrunk, hollowed out, emptied. And that lends the tone of this book a sort of melancholy, but it's a very elegiac melancholy, really. I wouldn't go so far as to describe it as solipsistic, that as if he's the last person in the world or the only person in the world. But it is just so beautifully, that sort of ongoing metaphor of shrunken horizons is beautifully built up, because in a way, a bit like writers like David Marks and stuff, a lot of the material in here is factual. That as he's walking, he's making associations of things. He's imagining and he's dreaming, because obviously he's staying in foreign to him hotels, not his own bed, but hotel beds every night, and he's having these strange dreams, which are often prompted by what he's seen during the day. And this is building up a picture of all these ghosts of life and sort of communities that have associations with these places in Suffolk, but are no longer present, other than maybe a ghostly presence. So, for example, the great storm in 1987 that wiped out so many trees, or the erosion of the cliff so that the village of Dunwich, or the town of Dunwich, fell into the sea, church by church. But there's also, so it's both man-made and natural sort of processes of emptying out, of decay and decline. Trawler fleets no longer being able to catch any fish, so they're all just abandoned on the beach and rusting. And a place where trawlermen used to meet up for a sort of social occasion has now been turned into a museum, because those trawlermen aren't visiting, and now nobody's visiting the museum even. It's another level of emptying out. Sort of stately homes in the area that have been left to sort of fall to rack and ruin. So there's very much this metaphor of decay and hollowing out. But there is also the associations that Sebald is making. So we get a history of silk production in Germany. We get the story of Sir Roger Casement, who was a British diplomat, who basically gave lots of dirt to the British government on Belgian colonial Congo, where basically the natives were treated as slaves by the Belgians. So, but unfortunately, Casement was very sort of seized by this sort of, this sort of public spirited and you know, wanted to do best for mankind. So one of his other causes was the Irish and Ireland under British rule. So he turned from Belgian colonial rule to his own country's colonial rule, at which point the government bristled, and he ended up being executed for treason. But before that they tried to smear him by sort of releasing his copies of his diaries and revealing him to be gay, which of course at that time was still hugely problematic. But the link there is this guy Casement knew Joseph Conrad, so we get a treatment from Sebald on, you know, sort of Conrad's youth and upbringing and his sort of you know, nomadic status on the high seas, you know, coming from sort of Polish nobility, but, you know, that being sort of usurped by the sort of invasions by the Russians. And then we get back to Casement, and that sort of modulation is so beautifully, you know, the chapter starts about Casement, and then almost immediately you're onto Conrad. And you almost forget about the whole Casement thing that set up this chapter, and then you come back to it. Sebald takes you effortlessly from one to another. You know, it doesn't read like sort of force feeding or anything. It's beautifully handled, and the way it's all tied up at the end, where, you know, a lot of these things seem quite random and unrelated, that they're prompted by his walking, but the way he ties it up, he brings them all together at the end is stupendous. And you do get a sense, you know, he's walking, you know, this isn't psychogeography, because he's not investing these places with new myths that psychogeography so often does. He is making associations that are personal to him and his reading and his research, and he puts it out there. He puts his dreams out there, but he's not forcing you to any conclusions. He's not saying, therefore this means that this place represents that. He's just laying it out there for, you know, almost like the sort of the sea lapping up onto the shore and then washing away again, you know, repeatedly. This is what he's not force feeding you. He's not telling you what to think about his dreams and everything. It is purely his subjective set of associations and his dreams and his imaginings and his research. You know, he's not investing it saying, because I feel this place must therefore represent that. He's not saying that at all. And it's just such a beguiling read. You know, there's not one wasted, you know, I'd say meander. It's not a meandering book at all. It's almost got the rhythm of walking. That's the extraordinary thing. You know, there's not one wasted gobbit of knowledge, you know, about Chinese dragons, about sort of stately home interiors and the nature of the decay of the gardens and stuff like that. It's just wonderful. You know, 5 stars. And on to Georges Perec, Memory of Childhood. So Celia and I had buddy read Life a User's Manual, which was her first Perec and my second. I'd read Avoid, and we both really liked Life a User's Manual. I mean, for me it was a step up from Avoid. And Celia mentioned when we finished reading that she had this on her bookshelf, and did we fancy buddy reading it later in the year. So I ordered a copy, and you can see it's quite short. We read this in 3 days at 50 pages or thereabouts a day. And oh wow, this just, you know, knocked both our socks off. It was extraordinary. So it's 2 narratives by a child, from the child's point of view, trying to reconstruct his childhood, which was around the time of the Second World War. He's a Jewish child, and, you know, he's moving from place to place to place to stay out of the clutches of the Nazis. So the first narrative is told in quite a straight way from the child's viewpoint, but it's very fragmented and fractured. It has this sense of always being on the move, not being able to lay down any roots. Nothing is embedded in his memory. It's all sort of, you know, lost as he moves on, because all the familiar you know, landmarks and you know, people he loses because he has to move on. So he's really struggling to reconstruct this memoir, and you know, every time he mentions a place or a person, he goes, well, the evidence seems to suggest that, but that's not how I remember it. So, for example, photographs, he you know, which presumably lay it down in stone as to who was with who at what point when, and he says, no, that can't be right. Or am I imagining this? Or is this what a family member has told me? So he's very, very unsure about the record that he's reproducing. And you get that real, you know, it's a really tender, you know, account of suffering when, you know, as a young child, he's not able to have any kind of firm roots, even within his own memory. And then we get a second narrative, which starts off as a sort of mystery, where this guy who, again, to stay out of the clutches of the Nazis, was given forged identity papers and managed to stay out of their clutches. And as an adult, he's working as a car mechanic. He's still looking over his shoulder, even though the war's over. You know, because he's basically not who he says he is. And he's approached by this stranger for a meeting. And he goes to the meeting, and the guy sort of says, well, you know, I know you're not who you say you are, because I know the real person, or I know of the real person whose papers you have. That person died as a kid in a sailing accident around the Tierra del Fuego, you know, this is one of the southernmost points of the earth. And that, you know, that's quite a page turner. You know, it's funny that the fragmented memory stuff of the child is also a page turner. In a way I can't quite, you know, lay my finger on it as to why, but it very much is. And the setup for this sort of mystery story is also a page turner. But then that narrative changes into, he goes to this place, into Tierra del Fuego, in search of clues to the lost boy, because the boating accident killed all the 5 adults on the boat, but the boy's body is never found. He sort of disappeared. So this narrator goes to Tierra del Fuego, and then that narrative turns into something totally different, where there's an island amongst the islands there, which is sort of set up and populated according to the spirit of the Olympics. It's all about Olympic, but in a way the original Greek Olympics, with a mixture of sort of Sparta and Plato's Republic. It's all very sort of rule bound and regimented. You know, the women can't compete in the athletics. They're basically only there for breeding. And it's very much like Sparta in that sense, where instead of breeding their men for war, they're breeding them here for athletic, you know, contests. And it's all a bit odd, really, and you're wondering how it ties back to the mystery sort of setup of it. But increasingly, this Olympic society is actually quite chaotic and random, and then it verges into violence. And unfortunately, I can't talk about why that is without giving spoilers, but just to say, the way Perec has moved you on subtly and unsuspectingly into sort of, you know, more and more horrific sort of, you know, tone of the book, and then how he ties the two narratives together at the end, is supreme. The only other book I've seen that has this sort of two completely seemingly unrelated narratives brought together is Murakami's Hardball Wonderland and the End of the World. But this, because of its subject matter, is even more powerful once those two narratives of the fragmentary boy's memory with this sort of strange Olympic society. Extraordinary work, and for me by far the best of the 3 Perecs I've read. The weird thing about Perec is I'd always been sort of slightly daunted by him, because I'd heard that he was this sort of supreme formalist, and it was, you know, his formalism was what sort of put him out there as an important writer. But actually he's a damn fine storyteller. You know, the stories that he weaves in Life a User's Manual, and the stories that he weaves here, first in the fragmented memoir, because he's only got a few lines, because the boy's then moved on, or is undermining what he's just said because he's not sure that it's true, or he's remembered it rightly, or he's not being fed a line. So you only get 3 or 4 lines, but the evocative story within that, and then of course this whole Olympic Village stuff. You know, he's a supreme storyteller. I mean, forget all the formalism. I mean, his formalisms aren't that radical. I mean, they were in a void, But actually, as I say, he's a fantastic storyteller. So there you have it. What a reading week for two modern classics: Sebald's The Rings of Saturn and Perec's The Memory of Childhood. Okay, till next time. Thanks very much.